I didn't see you there. Sorry, I was tending to my pea plant. What's a pea plant, you ask? Well, I think it's about time you heard the story of genetics. The story of genetics all started with Gregor Mendel. Here's a picture of him. Gregor Mendel was an Austrian monk, not Australian, Austrian, who loved to garden. And at his monastery in Austria, he had a garden where he tended to a variety of different plants. His most favorite plant of all was a pea plant. And we're going to tell you a little bit about this pea plant that Gregor Mendel studied and some of the traits that he looked at. The cool thing about Gregor Mendel is he did all of these genetic experiments before DNA was even discovered to be our genetic material. Gregor Mendel also knew a little bit about the basics of plant biology. He knew that there can be male parts and female parts. So you guys have probably all seen pollen before. This is going to gross you out a little bit, but pollen is basically plant sperm. And then there's some female parts of plants too that act as the egg. So plants sexually reproduce with pollen and eggs to make new plants. And we're going to take a look at what Gregor Mendel studied about these plants.
So talking about how plants reproduce, and particularly with Mendel's pea plants, right? He would use the flower, okay, which is the reproductive organ of a plant. And like Miss Graham said, right, the pollen, which is like the plant sperm, fertilizes the eggs inside flower, all right? And that's why for any type of plant that gives fruits and vegetables, right, it'll have some sort of fruit. So this flower, if it was like an apple tree, right, would turn into a fruit, apples that have seeds inside of it. Those seeds are the fertilized eggs, the new plants. If you plant them, you get new apple trees. So Mendel knew this was how plants reproduced, and he wanted to see how he could pass on different traits if he mated certain plants. In nature, right, fertilization occurs naturally where the male and female reproductive cells join. And if you think about nature, sometimes wind blows pollen around, like in the springtime, you'll see it in the summer, all that pollen all over your car and your windows. Nature also uses special pollinators like butterflies and honeybees that go around and spread pollen from plant to plant. So that's something that occurs many different ways in nature, right? But Mendel wanted to take control of it so he could control which plant reproduced with another. And basically, he would do two things here. He did self-pollination, right, which is took pollen from the same plant that he fertilized. So all the genetic info stayed the same in this one. And he also did cross-pollination, right? He took pollen from one plant and moved it over to another. And this allowed him to mate like different types of plants, which Miss Graham will tell you in a minute here, right? Like he could take a plant that had purple flowers, take its pollen and mate it with a plant that had white flowers. He could take a tall plant and mate it with a plant that was a short plant to see what happened. And a great way, so like I know you've got many avid gardeners out there, but I know many of you aren't doing pea plant pollinations. But one way you could think about it that might be a little more relatable would be like dogs. I know a lot of us have dogs or friends that have dogs, right? So, and this idea of a hybrid versus a purebred. Okay, so on the left and right, we have two pictures of purebred dogs. Okay, a poodle and a lab, or a yellow lab. So they're both pure. All this poodle's parents and parents and parents were all poodles, and these guys were all labs. So they're purebreds. All their ancestors were the same. If, though, you breed a poodle and a lab, yellow lab, you get a
Labradoodle.
Labradoodle. I had to think about that one. Okay, you get a Labradoodle here, where you can see he's got some cool traits of both. He's got the shaggy little hair of a poodle. He's got the golden color and a nice smile of a lab, and some of those retriever characteristics. So he would be like a hybrid, right? Where two parents were different and made something new. Kind of showing how those traits could get passed down through fertilization. So again, really important to remember that Mendel didn't work on dogs. Okay, he worked on pea plants. And obviously pea plants reproduce a little bit differently because they're way simpler than dogs. But this idea of a hybrid versus a purebred is really important to remember as we talk about what Mendel did in his experiment. plants.
All right. So in these pea plants that Mendel dedicated his life to studying, he looked at some different traits. He looked at 7 different traits. And there are 7 traits that he examined that could be one of 2 things. So, for example, the first trait was flower color. And the 2 choices for flower color for these pea plants were either purple or white. He studied the position of the flowers up the stem, what he referred to as axial. You can see it's going kind of up, terminal, all the flowers are at the end. He studied the seed color, yellow versus green, the seed shape, round versus wrinkled, the pod shaped, what he called inflated versus constricted, the color of the pod, green and yellow, and then the height of the plant, either tall or short, tall or dwarf is what he referred to it as. So these are the 7 traits that he looked at. Now, here's the cool thing. When he cross-pollinated, when he took, for example, a purple flowered plant and he crossed it with a white flowered pea plant, he always got purple offspring. All right, so that next generation, which we're going to call the F1, here's a little note here. P stands for like the parental generation. F1 would be like the kids, right? So this is our first generation. This is the first generation of offspring. When he studied axial versus terminal, he always got the axial. Yellow versus green, always got the yellow for seed color. Round versus wrinkled, always got the round. And you can see so on and so forth. So there was one trait when he cross-pollinated, always seemed to be occurring more frequently. Always seemed to be kind of hiding the other trait. So this purple, again, to go back to color, this purple flower was hiding or was stronger, taking over this white. Okay? And you're going to learn a little bit about what we call these things in genetics this week in class. And here's the last thing we want you to think about. So again, if this is the first generation, the parental generation, does P stand for something?
Parental.
It's a parental. I thought there was some big fancy Latin name for it. So again, if we take a tall plant and we made it with a short plant, we cross-pollinate it, we get tall plants. All the plants in that first generation are tall. But when we take these 2 tall plants from this F1 generation and we mate them together, something odd happens. We get 3 tall and 1 short. So this is how we want to end. We want you to spend a few minutes, and this will be your last question, thinking about this idea. So again, when we take to use Mr. Toda's words, when we take a purebred tall and we mate it with a purebred short, we get all tall. But when we take these 2 talls right here and we mate them, we get mostly tall, 3 tall to 1 short. So we want you to think about how come this short plant was able to show up down here in this second generation of offspring. And the hint to you is think about the idea of hybrids and purebreds. And this will lead into the discussion that you're going to have with your teacher in class this week. Thanks.